right. Well, welcome everybody. That was just a sampling of our podcast. We just wanted to play that so we gave everyone plenty of time to join the webinar here today. So thank you for joining us today. The chair of the Appraiser Qualifications Board, Mark Lewis, will be discussing potential changes to the criteria in the second exposure draft. Mark, do you want to introduce yourself real quick and then I'll do the same?
Sure. Well, I'll just say welcome everybody. Sorry that I'm a little nasally today. I've got a summertime cold that I generally get about this time of year. So I apologize for being a little nasally this morning. My name is Mark Lewis. I'm the chair of the Appraiser Qualifications Board. I'm an active real estate appraiser based out of Lufkin, Texas, which is about 2 hours north of Houston. And I'm in my eighth and final year as chair of the AQB. And I would just say welcome to the webinar.
Thanks, Mark. And I actually think your voice sounds good. It sounds like a country western singer. So it's okay if you sound nasally. I'm Lisa Desmarais. I'm the vice president of appraisal issues here at the Appraisal Foundation. And I was a residential appraiser for approximately 30 years before coming to work here last year. All right, now before we begin, we always start with a few quick housekeeping notes that I'm just going to run through. We do record this webinar, so you're going to see that recording post to our website and our YouTube channel in less than about 24 hours. And time permitting, at the end of the presentation, we do answer some of your questions. To ask a question, you just move your mouse to the bottom of your screen and the menu pops up. And one of those options says the word chat. You can just click on that. Or you can always just use your keyboard shortcut of Alt+H to make that chat box pop up. And we recommend you keep that chat box open because we do provide links and we ask for your feedback as we go throughout the webinar. And then at the very end of the webinar, we'll have a very quick and brief survey will pop up, and we just ask that you fill that out because that really helps us improve our webinars going forward. Okay, so for the agenda today, we are going to discuss the 3 sections of the second exposure draft to the criteria. Mark and I will do our best to explain all these areas and the questions that are being considered by the board. On the screen here, you see the 3 points we're going to be discussing. The revision to distance education requirements is on page 4 of your exposure draft. The addition to the criteria specified to the continuing education is on page 8. And the removal of 50% limitation of appraisal experience gained without a client in a traditional sense, that's on page 11. Then, as previously stated, time allowing, which we seem to always have, Mark will be answering questions and we will conclude with some quick information and some next steps for you. And before we move on, I want to tell you kind of an exciting thing. We have a new comment format. So we have already opened up, if you've already opened up and viewed the exposure draft that we're going to be discussing here today, you might have noticed that in addition to the traditional way that we have been receiving comments in the past, which was basically via email, we have added alternative ways for you to get your comments to us. So now you can click on a link and it's going to give you 3 options. You can attach your comments if you've written them in a Word or a PDF document. You can just type in your comments right there, just your comments related to the entire discussion draft. Or you can go through the discussion draft one question at a time and just provide very specific feedback to very specific questions. So we hope you find that useful. We've already started. We've already seen many more comments come in than before. So Mark, can you tell us a bit about the background on the second exposure draft before we begin?
Sure. We have, of course, with the release of the first exposure draft, the AQB received some positive feedback to the first exposure draft. So we went in and tweaked just a little bit, primarily in sections 1 of the exposure draft. We left sections 2 and 3 the same, but we wanted to give you another opportunity and take another opportunity to explain what changes are being proposed.
All right, then let's look at the first section here. This is the revision to distance education requirements, which is on page 4 of your second exposure draft. And note that we have all of the proposed changes. We're showing those on the screen, but we're not showing the rationale. So the rationale is in your draft if you want to refer to that. Mark, do you want to tell us about the edits the board has made to this section since the first exposure draft?
Sure. let's kind of do a little history lesson, I guess, just a minute, and go back, roll the clock back about a year and a half to the first part of 2020, when the pandemic began kind of rolling in, and we began to receive numerous comments from appraisers having difficulty taking their continuing education due to the lockdowns during the pandemic. So to help alleviate the problem, the AQB issued letters to the appraisal subcommittee, urging the subcommittee to use its discretion in allowing, without any further approval, approved classroom courses to be given synchronously. Synchronous being live and interactive. As a result, both educators and students that were taking advantage of this allowed discretion, the AQB received overwhelming feedback that the conversion of approved classroom courses to synchronous without any further approval had great demand, and actually the courses were very successful. And so we will discuss these 5 bullet points that are on your screen right now as we go through the exposure draft here in this webinar.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Let's see, we see here that the board is proposing expanding the definitions of distance education. Do you want to tell us more about that?
Sure, Lisa. The current criteria, the way it's constructed, is it just lumps everything together as distance education. It does not recognize any difference between synchronous distance education and asynchronous distance education. But again, the AQB received overwhelming feedback that the conversion of approved classroom courses to particularly synchronous education settings without any further approval were very, very successful. And so, as you can see on your screen, the AQB concluded earlier this year, based on that feedback and the success that we had, that essentially synchronous courses were equivalent to classroom class courses or in traditional in-person classroom. So as a result, the AQB saw a need to go into the criteria and go to this definition. And actually, we are proposing separating the definitions, particularly between synchronous and asynchronous courses. You can also see from the screen that this recognition led the AQB to propose these changes to distance education in order to try to distinguish 3 different areas that might come about: synchronous, asynchronous, and in this odd thing that is termed as a hybrid education event.
Well, I think that the public, the appraisers, regulators, and the education providers all really appreciate what the AQB has been doing, their responsiveness and their flexibility throughout the pandemic, and that they've seen that you have been continuing to explore opportunities to add flexibility, while preserving the intent of the criteria.
Sure.
We can see here that you have added an alternative source for course delivery approval. Do you want to go into a detail on that?
Yes, that's correct. The AQB is proposing to increase the number of delivery mechanism approvals to include the AQB itself and the Appraisal Foundation. And assuming that if the AQB adopts these changes, we will certainly have more information as far as delivery mechanism approvals. The main difference in this section from the first exposure draft is that this required delivery approval is only intended for asynchronous distance education. Again, this is in line with separating synchronous from asynchronous education, as we discussed in the previous slides, and would mean that course providers would not need approval for synchronous courses. But asynchronous courses, we are opening up a little bit and providing a little wider mechanisms for approval of the delivery mechanism, particularly for asynchronous courses.
And I know, Mark, that you've heard from numerous providers who appreciate this very much. So
Yes.
looking at the next slide, we have a breakdown on hybrid courses. And I don't believe that the AQB has done this in the past.
No, no. In fact, as things begin to progress and technology becomes more, and we get more accustomed to this interaction online, the need has come up to actually take a look at hybrid. Hybrid courses were not even mentioned previously in the criteria. But in this section, the board is proposing that hybrid courses, if you're going to do a hybrid course, that the section that is not synchronous or whatever section that you're doing in a hybrid, whether it's a mixture of live and synchronous or live and asynchronous, whatever part that deals with has to comply with that part of the criteria. So if you're doing a live and asynchronous hybrid, then the asynchronous part of that class needs to conform with the asynchronous requirements. If you're doing live and synchronous delivery, then that synchronous part needs to comply with the synchronous sections of the criteria.
Okay. And then switching topics a little bit here, one consideration that kind of comes up when we're talking about distance education is remote proctoring. You want to fill them in a little on that?
Sure. Again, technology is fast moving, and the AQB is trying to keep up with with technology a little bit. So biometric proctoring is an effective form of automated proctoring technology. During the biometric proctoring process, student identity is continually verified through facial recognition, consistency in keystroke cadence could be, the observation of activity around the testing center. Do you see folks coming in and out? And then any aberrant behavior or activity resulting from that remote proctoring can actively be observed and reported. And so while the section is consistent with Part F, Section 6A, which mentions that proctoring is available from this type, but we are pulling in some technology and saying that's okay to use biometric proctoring as a remote style proctoring service.
Okay, so let's look at proposed changes to this section. Now, let's look at some of the questions that the board wants you to think about in this section. What we're going to do is have you answer in the chat box. Here are some of the questions on your screen, and I'm just going to quickly read them to you. This is to elicit, have more feedback from you directly during this webinar. You can always provide your comments later by opening up that exposure draft and clicking on those links. But this is just in case you're having some thoughts while Mark has been talking through this. The first question, did you benefit from AQB's allowance for in-person courses to be offered online? The second question, do you have any proposed changes to the definitions of synchronous? Do you have any comments on the proposed changes to the definitions of synchronous, asynchronous, and hybrid courses? Do you think the addition of an alternative course approval mechanism will be beneficial? And do you have any experience with remote proctoring or biometric proctoring? Again, we're just trying to get some of your feedback from you here today because the board will go through all of these comments that are put in the chat box here. So Mark, while they're working on that, do you want to tell us more about the next section of the exposure draft, which is titled the addition to criteria specific to continuing education?
Sure. If you'll remember, Vice Chair John Ryan covered all the changes from this section in a previous webinar, which you can actually view by clicking on a link in the chat room that'll be popping up here just shortly. But because these items were covered previously, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time in this section. but we do want to cover it.
Well, then go right ahead,
So,
Mark. Tell us about the addition of that new CE
all
topic.
right, perfect. The new topic of valuation bias, fair housing, and or equal opportunity. We added those specifically in approved topics for continuing education as new topic F in this section. As you know, fair housing and equal opportunity concerns in relation to the appraisal practice have become more pronounced recently. The revision will highlight this topic as a necessary form of continuing education. It's been our position that these topics have always been in the criteria as an approved topic under E, ethics and standards of professional appraisal practice. But we wanted to make sure that to remove any doubt, we're going to put it in specifically that it is an allowable continuing education topic.
And then how about, let's see, guide note 1.
Sure. Guide note 1 now deals with qualifying education, which is different from continuing education, but qualifying education. This is the education needed to become an appraiser, not to maintain your certification. But we went into guide note 1, which is a guide note, but we specifically added the issue of bias, fair housing, and equal opportunity as a new topic or topic H. Again, we think it was always there. It was always acceptable, but we're trying to highlight it here in guide note 1.
Perfect. Thanks for going through that section so quickly. We have now come to the last section of the exposure draft, and this is the removal of the 50% limitation of appraisal experience gained without a client in the traditional sense. And this is in the generic experience section D of the criteria. So note that there were no changes made to this section from the first exposure draft. So the board is still proposing the exact same edits, but even so, I'm gonna still have Mark run through some of these proposed changes here.
Sure. If this section of the criteria has been in the criteria for a long time. The idea that you can gain some experience from non-traditional clients. And, I kind of deem this as, and kind of have adopted the language of this is kind of the demo report type of an assignment. But as you note, the board is staying course on this proposed change. But to refresh our memory, the criteria currently allows up to 50% of all experience to be granted for experience gained for work completed without a traditional client. In the first exposure draft, the AQB proposed removing this limitation and allowing up to 100% of all experience to be obtained without a traditional client. We got some feedback and we saw that many of the commenters may have misinterpreted this proposed change to mean, well, that's no more field experience, no more inspecting properties, no more supervisors for experience credits. And that's just not the case. This change would not eliminate anything related to field experience under this scenario. It just brings this section into more alignment with PREA, which allows up to 100% of experience to be gained through a PREA program. Well, this brings that into alignment that you can also get up to 100% of your experience through non-traditional clients. Now, let's get practical here. How realistic is somebody going to get all of their experience from non-traditional clients? It's probably not very realistic that you're going to be knocking on your neighbor's doors and saying, can I appraise your house for the purpose of gaining my credential? And then, doing that however many times you need to, and exhausting all your family members appraising their homes too. It's probably not very realistic, but we are bringing them into alignment. Again, this has been in the criteria for a very long time. Some of the states have been using it to fill in gaps that may be in getting experience validated. But this is not a huge change. This is just changing the 50% to 100% and allowing a little more flexibility.
Perfect. Let's see here. I think on the next slide we have the actual, there we go. This is how it appears in the exposure draft if you're looking for this section that Mark has been talking to you about. So Mark, as the board usually does, they really they actually do align the guidance with the proposed changes to the criteria for consistency. So because of that, I think you're also proposing another change to guide note 4.
That is correct. That is correct. As you stated, these proposed revisions will bring this guide note in line with the main thrust of the proposals, which is to remove the limitations on how much experience can be gained without this traditional client. When this section was first added to the criteria, it was written at a time when a program such as PREA was not fully imaginable. But given how greatly technology has changed, what's now possible in a virtual environment allows for a new way of envisioning how appraisers may gain required experience. The proposed changes eliminates the viewpoint that experience received in a classroom type setting may not result in minimal competency. The goal of any experience requirements, whether obtained in or out of the classroom, is for the individual to become minimally qualified as an appraiser, not to have gained full competency in all types of appraisal assignments or in all geographic areas. And on this slide, you can see where the guide note for the proposed changes are actually taking place. And you can also see in this guide note the language that is proposed for deletion. Again, in the AQB's opinion, this is not a major change, but it brings the guide note into alignment with the criteria.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. We may just appreciate you making a summary of the entire second exposure draft there. So thanks for doing that.
You're welcome.
And right now, what we have for everybody is we have another question for you. And before I ask these questions, I would like to say that I have access to watch the chat box go by here, and it's just been flying by. So we really, really appreciate these comments. And Mark, you're going to be thrilled to see what everyone's putting there. I haven't had time to read them. I just note that we're having a considerable number of comments coming in. So here are our two final questions for you. Do you think that the removal of the 50% limitation of appraisal experience gained without a client in the traditional sense will be beneficial? And the second question, have you gained experience for work without a traditional client? If so, what percentage? So we're just kind of collecting data and information from you there. And we really, like I said, really appreciate your comments. Fill those in the chat box, or you can always do it later through the exposure draft. Okay, at this point, I knew this would be a pretty quick webinar because, Mark gave this webinar before and we were just updating on any changes, but now it's time for you to be able to ask questions. So always bear in mind with us, if we have any minor delays while we're trying to recognize and unmute individuals, AIDA always takes care of that. So if you would like to speak, please raise your digital hand. And to raise your hand, you click on the participants button on the Zoom menu and then the raise hand button at the bottom of the screen. If you do not wish to speak, but you have an observation or question, you can just type that in the chat box. And after the call, we will aggregate the chat box and give that all to the entire board to review. So Aida, she's monitoring the hand raising, and she and I may go back and forth because I'm looking at the questions in the chat box and she's watching the hands. But Aida, if you want to start with anybody you see there, and then you can bump it back to me if we need to get one of the questions from the chat box.
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. So I've been kind of watching, some hands went up, some hands went down. Looks like we finally have one. It's for Robert Abelson. Robert, you should be able to speak. I have sent you a request to unmute yourself.
Great. So if I'm teaching a live stream class like I've been doing right now for CE, will that continue and similar to the classroom, and the same thing for basic ed, qualifying education, that we can teach a live stream class like using Zoom. Students will participate in that, and then we can use remote proctoring. Is the approval process the same as a classroom, or anything else we have to do?
Well, sure. I appreciate the comment. The intention of AQB is to equate synchronous delivery of education with live classroom. So, the states can always add to minimum requirements. So you still need to check with your state. But as far as AQB is concerned, if it's good for classroom, it's good for synchronous.
Thank you, Mark. Lisa, I think that was it. We only had that
Okay.
one hand.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, I've got a lot of questions in the chat box, so I'll start with those. Is remote proctoring possible without biometric technology? And what are the minimum requirements for that? I don't know if you can answer all that, Mark, but I'm just proposing the question to you.
We have, there's always been in the criteria section that says that remote proctoring is okay. Or proctoring or examinations by computer are okay for those sections. But Lisa, say the question one more time. I'm getting old and I'm forgetting.
I already scrolled past it. I think he's asking what the minimum requirements are going to be for bioproctoring.
Okay.
Biometric proctoring.
I'm not for sure that minimum requirements are there, but what we are saying is that there are multiple ways to do this. It can be highly sophisticated, of which I have a little experience with, like taking examinations and being monitored by a software program that's monitoring my eye movement, recognizing my facial features, noticing if anybody's moving in or if I'm turning away. Or something like that. That's a fairly highly sophisticated program, of which is getting easier to use in the marketplace and cheaper to use, as I understand. But I know the Appraisal Foundation has used active monitors. So if actually having proctors watching people take the exam on screen. So there's multiple ways to do this, but we're trying to open up the avenues and options for allowing remote proctoring.
Great, thank you. This is a two-part question, so if you want me, I'll read the whole thing, and then if you just want to answer one, then I can read the second part again.
Okay.
Okay. Is a state regulatory agency considered an AQB approved organization? Would they be able to approve synchronous delivery mechanisms? So basically, is a state regulatory agency an AQB approved organization?
That's an excellent question. I'm going to hope I give you the right answer here. But states have always been able to approve their education. And Lisa, you correct me if I'm off the bandwagon here.
No.
But I would say yes. States have always have had that opportunity to do that.
Yeah, they're just not technically an approved organization. They don't need to be, because they can just do it on their own without coming through us. The second part of that question was, if not, how does an independent entity or state regulatory agency become AQB approved? Okay, we don't need to answer that because, yeah, the AQB, yeah, sorry.
Good.
It's not easy to read and think and listen at all the same time.
I understand.
Lisa, if you want,
yeah.
I can jump in. We have a raised hand.
Yes, please.
Okay. Mark Giannini, I have just sent you the request to unmute yourself.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, folks. Thanks so much once again, everybody, for allowing the appraiser on the street to comment and ask questions. I think this is one of the most valuable aspects of what you do, is being able to listen to us and get our feedback, through this medium. My question is, how can appraisers buy into the removal of the 50% experience rule without knowing yet what PRE is going to look like? I mean, do you think that you're putting the cart before the horse with with removing this and then saying, well, you know, trust us, there's going to be this optional training program and we don't know what it is yet. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know, you know, how it's going to be developed and molded and rolled out, but just trust us and let us remove the 50% experience rule. Do you think you should rather wait to see what Perea looks like and how successful it is before this 50% rule is eliminated? Thank you again.
Well, Mark, I appreciate the comment. You know, one thing to clearly understand is that the experience obtained from a non-traditional or non-business type client, it's been in there for a very long time. It's still there. I doubt if anybody has ever actually gotten 50% of their experience approved through this source. So, you know, it's there. It's there prior to Perea. Now, Perea was just adopted in January, so it long predated Perea. So the only thing we are doing is just aligning that with Perea and saying if Perea will allow up to 100% of experience through a non-traditional methodology, why not this section that's been around in the criteria for a long time? So that's all we did. It's not as earth-shattering as it sounds, because again, it has been in the criteria for a very long time, and it's been used in somewhat limited fashion, particularly by states in the approval process.
Yeah, I think, Mark, the important thing that I hear people misunderstand is this change, this 50% to 100% change, is just bringing it in line with Perea. They aren't related to one another necessarily. They're two different requirements.
That's correct. Remember, we got three different avenues you can go down for experience. There's the traditional supervisor trainee that's been in the model ever since the beginning. Then we added in January, we added Perea as an option, of which we don't have any approved Perea courses yet or programs yet. We have a lot of interest, but nothing's been approved yet. And then this third option is the non-traditional client or non-business purpose client option, of which, you know, again, has been in there a long time and used relatively limitedly over the years.
And on that same topic, this is a philosophical question, so we'll see how much answer this person will get, but it's a good one. I've never heard it before.
Oh,
If
good.
you are removing the 50% requirement, why not just remove that section altogether? Since there's no longer a difference between traditional and demonstration appraisals.
Well, that's a great suggestion. I would say we need to take baby steps before we start looking at that. So it's an incremental deal right now. So, but a great observation though.
Yeah. As for the valuation bias education requirement, we are noticing that some states are requiring a certain number of education hours for this. Is there guidance on how many hours of that education should be taken and how often?
No, right now AQB is simply folding that information into primarily the USPAP update class that every appraiser has to take. And I think our buddies over at ASB will be coming out with some guidance with that. But as far as AQB is concerned, we are not specifically requiring specific courses dealing with just fair housing and those issues. Now, you are correct that there's liable to be, and there are states that are adding specific classes that have to be completed. But that's on a state-by-state basis. I don't, you know, it wouldn't shock me to see that become very commonplace throughout the states. But right now, AQB is not putting out a minimum requirement.
Okay, great. Does this mean we are no longer required to get IDEC approval for all courses?
Good question. Remember, we have expanded the options for asynchronous delivery approvals. It has been in currently is IDEC was about the only good choice for approval of that. We are now proposing to open that up where IDEC is not the only option out there. Certainly you can still use IDEC under this proposal, but there are going to be other options available.
Does the foundation have its approval course already, approval process already worked out, or is that in the future if this passes?
Sure, and that question has come up very recently, but we're taking the steps. We get our proposal approved, assuming that the feedback is good, and we don't find any fatal flaws within the second exposure draft. And if it gets approved by AQB, there'll be an effective date on it. And once that gets set, then you will see stuff come out from the Appraisal Foundation as to a matrix of what would be required for approval of asynchronous delivery.
Perfect. And then this follows up exactly what you're saying. If somebody wants to know, when can I stop submitting my courses to IDEC?
Hang on. Don't get ahead of yourself.
That's right. If a course is approved for classroom, is it automatically approved for synchronous under the new proposed changes?
Under the new proposed changes, again, synchronous, as far as AQB minimum is concerned, is going to be considered equivalent to classroom. So whatever you're doing for classroom, do for synchronous. And that's about as simple as I can make it.
Aida, I'm checking with you. Do you have anybody who would like to ask a question?
Thanks, Lisa. We actually have two. We have Melissa Bond. And Melissa, you should see the unmute button pop up.
Okay, can you hear me?
Ken,
Yes.
welcome.
Oh, very good. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Mark. Excellent, excellent information, guys. Thank you, as always. One thing I wanted to say, if you don't mind, if we jump right back to that experience being 100% non-traditional, or removing that 50% limitation, whichever way. One of the things I just would like to note that if, in non-traditional assignments, as well as in demonstration reports, an appraiser or appraiser trainee can still develop those reports that align with some of the GSE guidance and some of the federal overlays like your FHA, VA, and USDA. So in non-traditional client situations, that experience can be gained. And then if you're looking at some of the nuances that perhaps the trainee won't have, is dealing with a client, but that is basically a business skill, and it's a business skill that is developed. And I can say this, over my entire 29 years of appraising, I'm still developing those business skills. So, I think that's something that we can consider, that's going to perhaps be that missing component, but we're still developing it, each and every one of us, every day. So I think removing the 50% limitation it's just time for that to happen. I agree.
Well, I couldn't have said that better myself, and I probably didn't say it better. But thank you, Melissa. Yeah, I tend to, I like the non-traditional experience because you can do a lot with that. You can, and you're not limited to whatever scope that particular client is looking for. But you can actually go out and do an appraisal and have your client maybe the state or whatever you're working in, and the intended use of the assignment is for credentialing purposes. And then go and do your appraisal. And to me, that makes a lot of sense to be able to do that. It's kind of like operating on a mannequin instead of a live person. You can still get a lot of experience from that.
Thanks, Mark. We have one last raised hand, and it's from Herbert Mayer. And I've just sent the unmute request.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning, Herb. How are you?
Good afternoon, I guess it is. Mark and Lisa, my comments are my own comments. I'm not representing any organization today. I can walk both sides of the 50% thing. One, I'm worried that you'll have people doing a lot of cookie cutter reports and getting certified with missing half of the experience of being out there where they need somebody holding a hand on their backside. The other, on the flip side, for somebody that's doing evaluations, some nasty things they are, in the state of Illinois, they say that the state has to be the client, and as you say, for the sake of credentialing, but could someone, I think someone doing evaluations could turn in their evaluation and then turn around and write a second report, being a appraisal report on that property that would not be turned into a client, but rather held for the state. So I got both directions on that. And that's where I'll drop.
Well, thanks, Herb. I just want to kind of stress that I've been stressing for a very long time that the credentialing process is a minimum qualification idea. So you talk about cookie cutter houses. I just wish that I had the availability of tract level houses that I could do cookie cutter reports and get my credential. Unfortunately, I'm in East Texas where we don't have any tract housing. There's no such thing as cookie cutter. And so, but we are still talking about minimum criteria and minimum qualifications. So that doesn't mean when you go into to your state for approval of your experience that it has to include every kind of assignment that you can imagine. But you should be able to do the typical assignment with typical and minimum use PAP compliance. And that's what AQB is about. We're not about putting extra levels of requirements in order to gain your credential. We are at the minimum level. And so that's kind of hard to grasp, but we are talking about a minimally qualified individual getting credentialed.
Mark, I have a question that keeps popping up. It's the same question written differently by different people. I know you've answered it twice, but I think they're so excited to hear the answer that I'm just going to ask it one more time. And that is, under this direction, we won't have to obtain approval for each delivery method for classroom or synchronized. They are one and the same, correct?
That is what AQB is proposing. So again, check with your state, but that is what is AQB proposing for minimum criteria.
Perfect, thank you. And just to clarify also, active proctoring can be done virtually, correct, under this proposal?
That's the way we are proposing. That's correct. I think you're getting it.
I love it. I love it. Aida, do you have any other questions? Otherwise, I think we can actually wrap up a little early here.
No, that's it. That was the last one.
Okay. I just want to thank everybody for the comments I see in the chat box. There are literally hundreds. So we have got a lot of feedback there. We look forward to hearing from you. The comment deadline is July 30th. And to submit your comments, you have the link right there. It's also in the exposure draft and on our website as well. Or if you have any questions, you can just email us, aqb@appraisalfoundation.org. And we really invite you to come to the public meeting. This is when this exposure draft will be decided what direction they will go with it. And I guess that's it. Mark, do you have any last words before we sign off? Yeah.
Let me add one other thing.
Okay.
That I'm sure a lot of you have gotten in your email box announcement from the Appraisal Foundation that there are open spots for or taking applications for AQB and ASB members. And so, you know, we're the folks that are serving on these boards, we're just like you. We are appraisers. We are serving in a capacity. And if you want to join us and join one of those boards, I would encourage you to make application. It is very competitive. There are very highly qualified folks that apply every year. But make application, make yourself available, and support your profession this way.
Thank you, Mark. And I'll just reiterate, it is very competitive. It is life-changing. It's very rewarding. And sometimes you don't make it through the first round, and sometimes you'll make it on the board a second round. So you just keep trying. It just depends on what makeup or what kind of expertise they need on any particular year. So thank you, Mark. I appreciate you saying that. Please make sure and fill out the very quick and brief survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. And we just want to thank you so much for being with us. And we hope to hear from you. Have a great day.
Thank you. See you, folks. Be safe.
Bye.